The constable arrived within 20 minutes, summoned by a telephone call placed by Eleanor Ashford with a trembling voice, and by the time Constable Edward Hartley had made his way through the village streets to St. Mary's Village Hall, the exhibition had taken on the quality of a crime scene, though perhaps not in the manner that the law would officially recognize it. The crowd, rather than dispersing as one might have expected, had instead clustered in smaller groups throughout the hall, their conversations reduced to urgent whispers and anxious murmurs, while Dame Constance Whitmore sat rigidly in a chair that had been hastily provided, her hands folded precisely in her lap, her eyes fixed upon some point beyond the visible world with an expression of such controlled fury that several of the village women found themselves instinctively stepping back from her presence. Constable Hartley was a competent enough officer, a man of perhaps 50 with the measured demeanor of someone who had spent his life in a quiet corner of England where serious crime was virtually unknown, and his first action was to examine the damaged panel with the careful attention of someone who understood that he was witnessing something that transcended mere vandalism. He photographed the destruction with a small camera, made notes in a leather notebook with a pencil that he moistened periodically with his tongue, and asked the assembled crowd a series of questions that Miss Marple, observing from her position near a display of particularly fine quilts, found to be adequate but not particularly penetrating in their nature. "Now then," Constable Hartley said, his voice carrying that peculiar combination of authority and uncertainty that characterized men thrust suddenly into unusual situations, "I shall need to speak with anyone who was in this area between, shall we say, 4 o'clock and the time of the discovery. Can anyone tell me precisely when they last observed this panel intact?" The question hung in the air, and what followed was a confused sequence of statements in which various attendees attempted to recall their movements and observations with the sort of vague precision that characterizes the memory of people engaged in leisurely activities. No one, it seemed, had been paying particular attention to Dame Constance's display at any given moment, and the hall's layout, with several tall display stands creating natural barriers and sightlines, meant that the corner where the destruction had occurred possessed a certain privacy that would have made the crime difficult to witness. Eleanor Ashford spoke up, her voice still trembling slightly, to explain that she had been occupied with greeting visitors and managing the guest book near the entrance, and therefore had not been continuously aware of what was occurring in all areas of the hall. Mrs. Margaret Thornton, the woman whose earlier criticism had created such palpable tension, stated rather defensively that she had been examining the quilts near the far wall and had seen nothing whatsoever. Mrs. Helena Marks, whose work had been the subject of Margaret's harsh critique, stood quietly near one of the refreshment tables, a cup of tea in her hand that she had not drunk, her expression carefully neutral in a manner that somehow suggested considerable emotional restraint. What struck Miss Marple most forcefully as she observed this initial investigation was not what she saw, but rather what she did not see, specifically the absence of any expression of genuine surprise or shock upon several faces. Dame Constance's fury was real and terrible, certainly, but Eleanor's distress seemed to contain an element of something else beneath its surface, something that flickered across her features in the moments when she thought herself unobserved. Mrs. Margaret Thornton, while expressing appropriate dismay at such an outrage, seemed to possess a certain satisfaction around the eyes that suggested the destruction might not entirely displease her, though whether this stemmed from malice toward the dame or from some other motivation was not immediately apparent. Most intriguing of all was Helena Marks, who had been so publicly criticized mere moments before the discovery, and who maintained her composed exterior with what seemed to Miss Marple to be almost theatrical precision. It was precisely the sort of careful control that one exhibits when one is consciously managing one's emotional presentation to the world, and Miss Marple had observed enough of human nature in her many years to recognize that such careful management frequently concealed depths of feeling that required concealment. As Constable Hartley continued his preliminary questioning, speaking now privately with Dame Constance, who answered his questions in short, clipped sentences that suggested she was barely maintaining her composure, Miss Marple found her attention drawn to the other attendees and their interactions with one another. She observed that several of the younger women seemed to be avoiding eye contact with Helena, that there existed an awkwardness around Mrs. Thornton that suggested her earlier rudeness had created more lasting offense than her tone might have indicated, and that Eleanor, despite her attempts at professional composure, possessed a tension in her shoulders that spoke of considerable anxiety concerning not merely vandalism itself, but perhaps some deeper concern about its implications. The vicar, the Reverend Edmund Ashford, had arrived some 10 minutes after Constable Hartley, having been telephoned by his wife, and he moved among the crowd with his characteristic gentleness, offering words of comfort and reassurance while his eyes, keen and observant behind his spectacles, watched the proceedings with the careful attention of a man accustomed to perceiving the struggles that lay beneath the surface of his parishioners' lives. By the time the constable had declared that the exhibition must be temporarily closed and that no one should touch the damaged panel pending a more thorough investigation by officers from the regional constabulary, the pleasant autumn afternoon had transformed entirely into something darker and far more complex, leaving Miss Marple standing quietly with her cup of now cold tea, her pale eyes moving thoughtfully from face to face, beginning already to weave together the threads of motive, opportunity, and the peculiar patterns of human behavior that would eventually reveal which among these seemingly ordinary village people had harbored sufficient anger, jealousy, or desperation to commit such an act of deliberate and calculated destruction. The officers from the regional constabulary arrived at approximately 6 o'clock in the evening, by which time the autumn sun had descended below the horizon and the village hall had taken on that peculiar quality of institutional coldness that such spaces acquire when stripped of their intended purpose and converted into something more official and therefore less welcoming. Detective Inspector James Thornton, a man bearing no apparent relation to Mrs. Margaret Thornton, though Miss Marple found herself wondering whether there might be some connection worth investigating, was a figure of considerable competence, a towel. Man, with grey threading through his dark hair, and the sort of measured demeanor that suggested long experience with human misbehavior in all its various manifestations. He arrived accompanied by a younger detective sergeant named David Collins and a police photographer who immediately set about documenting the damaged panel from every conceivable angle, his camera's flash illuminating the destruction with a harsh clinical light that rendered the violation even more apparent than it had seemed in the gentler illumination of the afternoon. Inspector Thornton conducted a brief initial examination of the scene himself, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes moving methodically across the torn embroidery with the careful attention of someone trained to observe what others might miss, and then he turned his attention toward the assembled villagers who had been requested to remain available for questioning. The interviews were conducted in a small adjoining room that ordinarily served as a storage space for the hall's equipment, and Miss Marple observed that the inspector approached his task with a systematic methodology that, while thorough, seemed to her somewhat lacking in psychological insight. He questioned each person regarding their movements, their observations, and their knowledge of Dame Constance and her work. But he appeared to accept the explanations, offered at face value, without probing the emotional undercurrents that Miss Marple had detected so readily. When he spoke with Mrs. Margaret Thornton, he accepted her explanation that she had been examining the quilts with a courteous nod, apparently not noticing the slight elevation of her chin that suggested defensive pride rather than mere innocent explanation. When Helena Marks provided her account of her movements, the inspector received her composed responses without apparent recognition that such CT composure might itself warrant deeper investigation. Eleanor Ashford, when her turn came, spoke in a voice that wavered between nervousness and what seemed to Miss Marple to be a carefully constructed narrative, yet the inspector seemed satisfied with her explanation that the responsibilities of managing the exhibition had kept her occupied near the entrance. What fascinated Miss Marple most acutely was the conversation that occurred when Inspector Thornton questioned Dame Constance herself, a discussion that took place in the presence of the inspector and Sergeant Collins, but to which Miss Marple was not permitted direct access. However, she observed from her vantage point in the main hall, where she had been allowed to remain, having been dismissed as merely an elderly village woman of no particular significance, that when the dame emerged from that interview, Her expression had shifted from fury to something more akin to grim determination, and she spoke briefly with Eleanor Ashford in tones so low that even Miss Marple's excellent hearing could not distinguish the words, though the intensity of their communication suggested that some matter of considerable importance was being discussed. This exchange did not escape the notice of either Mrs. Margaret Thornton or Helena Marks, both of whom observed the interaction with sharp attention, and Miss Marple found herself noting the subtle ways in which their reactions differed. Margaret seemed to contain an element of alarm, while Helena's appeared to encompass something more complex, something that might have been understanding mixed with resignation. By 8 o'clock in the evening, as the preliminary interviews were being concluded and the damaged panel had been carefully removed from its display and secured as evidence, Inspector Thornton made a public statement to the assembled group, indicating that the matter LD require further investigation, and that he would be returning the following morning to conduct more detailed interviews with key individuals. He explained that the destruction appeared to have been accomplished with some force and with deliberate intention, and that while vandalism was not ordinarily pursued with great vigor by the constabulary, the value of the damaged work and the apparent motivation behind the destruction suggested that this matter warranted more thorough attention. As the crowd began to disperse, filtering out into the cool autumn evening, Miss Marple noted with interest the ways in which people departed, some in clusters, others singly, and she particularly observed that Helena Marks left the village hall alone, while Eleanor Ashford departed in conversation with Margaret Thornton, a pairing that seemed to Miss Marple somewhat surprising given the earlier tension between them regarding Margaret's criticism. Most intriguingly, she noticed that the vicar remained behind after the others had gone, speaking in hushed tones with Inspector Thornton near the entrance to the hall, their conversation apparently concerning some matter of sufficient delicacy that they moved to a position where they believed themselves to be beyond the hearing of others. Miss Marple, gathering her handbag and preparing to depart herself, found her mind already assembling the pieces of this peculiar puzzle, recognizing in the patterns of behavior and emotional response that she had observed the early indicators of a mystery far deeper and more troubling than mere vandalism. A mystery that seemed to reach backward into the private histories of the village inhabitants and forward into consequences that no one had yet fully comprehended. The morning following the exhibition's destruction dawned grey and overcast, the kind of autumn day that seemed to press down upon the village, with a weight of something beyond mere meteorological melancholy. And by 9 o'clock, Inspector Thornton and Sergeant Collins had established themselves in the village hall's adjoining office with a methodical determination that suggested they intended to uncover whatever secrets lay beneath the surface of St. Mary's pleasant facade. Miss Marple, having spent the previous evening in her cottage reflecting upon the day's events and reviewing in her mind the various patterns of behavior she had observed, decided that a visit to the village post office might prove illuminating, as she had learned long ago that postmistresses possessed a knowledge of their communities that rivaled or exceeded that of any official investigator. Mrs. Dorothy Patterson, who had managed the post office for the better part of 20 years, was a woman of considerable discretion generally, but Miss Marple possessed the particular ability to elicit information through the simple mechanism of asking indirect questions about matters that seemed entirely innocuous, until one connected them to the larger tapestry of village life. She inquired casually about whether Dame Constance had been receiving much correspondence since her arrival in the village for the exhibition, and Mrs. Patterson, after a brief hesitation that suggested she was considering the bounds of confidentiality, mentioned that the dame had indeed received several letters bearing the postmark of London, and that notably several of these letters had arrived bearing the return address of a solicitor's office located in Bloomsbury. This detail, seemingly minor on its surface, struck Miss Marple as potentially significant, for it suggested that Dame Constance's presence in the village was connected to matters beyond merely displaying her needlework, and the involvement of a solicitor hinted at legal complications of some variety. Where? And Miss Marple inquired further, with the sort of gentle persistence that was one of her principal virtues. Mrs. Patterson mentioned that she had observed Helena Marks also receiving correspondence from London with some regularity, and that on one occasion she had distinctly noticed that a letter addressed to Helena bore the same solicitor's office as return address. This revelation, emerging as it did from the reliable if previously underutilized source of the village post mistress, suggested to Miss Marple that there existed some connection between Dame Constance and Helena Marks that transcended their apparent roles as exhibiting needleworkers, a connection that might well extend backward through time in ways that were not immediately apparent to casual observation. After departing the post office with her morning correspondence in hand, a collection of bills and periodicals that held little interest for her, Miss Marple proceeded to the village library, where the librarian, Mrs. Constance Weatherby, maintained not only current volumes, but also back copies of various newspapers and magazines, a resource that Miss Marple had found invaluable on previous occasions when seeking to understand the histories of her neighbors. What she discovered in the newspaper archives, after requesting several bound volumes of the Manchester Evening News from approximately 3 years prior, proved to be both illuminating and troubling in equal measure. A careful examination of the issues from that period revealed that Helena Marks had indeed been employed by the Ashford Textile Manufacturing Company, a concern based in Manchester that had apparently been a significant employer in that city before its closure, approximately 2 years earlier. More intriguingly, the newspapers covering the closure of the company revealed that the closing had been accompanied by considerable scandal and financial irregularities, with investigations conducted by both company auditors and subsequently by local police regarding the misappropriation of funds amounting to several £1,000s. The newspapers had hinted at internal conflict between members of the company's management regarding the disposition of various accounts, and one article in particular had mentioned that several employees had alleged that designs and proprietary techniques had been stolen from the company and used in unauthorized ways by individuals claiming to possess legitimate rights to the materials. As Miss Marple sat in the quiet of the library, reviewing these old articles with her characteristic attention to detail, she found herself constructing a hypothesis regarding the possible relationships between the various parties involved in the current situation, a hypothesis that suggested that the destruction of Dame Constance's embroidered panel might represent the violent conclusion to a dispute that had begun years earlier in the industrial city of Manchester and had somehow followed its principles to this quiet English village. When she departed the library and made her way toward the post office to post a letter she had written that morning to an old friend in London who possessed connections with the textile world, Miss Marple observed that Inspector Thornton was conducting interviews with several of the village's residents near the entrance to the village hall, and that his demeanor suggested a certain frustration, as though the investigation was not progressing in the manner he had anticipated. She also noted that Eleanor Ashford was entering the hall with an expression of considerable anxiety, and that there existed a marked tension in her bearing that suggested she possessed knowledge of matters that she had not yet disclosed to the authorities. Upon reaching her cottage that afternoon, Miss Marple found a telephone message waiting for her, conveyed through her neighbor Mrs. Hudson, indicating that Inspector Thornton desired to speak with her at her earliest convenience. A summons that Miss Marple found both expected and somewhat amusing, for it suggested that the inspector had belatedly recognized what the village already knew, that Miss Jane Marple, despite her apparent insignificance, possessed an understanding of village affairs that no official investigation could hope to replicate without her assistance. Miss Marple arrived at the village hall at precisely 3 o'clock in the afternoon, having taken care to dress in her most respectable attire and to bring with her a small notebook in which she had recorded certain observations that she thought might prove useful to the inspector's investigation, though she held no illusions regarding how her contributions might be received by a man accustomed to relying upon professional methodology rather than the sort of intuitive observation that characterized her own approach to understanding human behavior. Inspector Thornton received her in the small office with a courtesy that suggested he was willing to listen to whatever she might offer, though his expression carried the faint suggestion of skepticism that many men in positions of official authority reserve for the suggestions of elderly women whose primary qualification consists of having lived in a village for many years. He gestured toward a chair positioned across from his makeshift desk, and Miss Marple settled herself with the careful deliberation of someone whose bones required such consideration, folding her hands in her lap in a posture of attentive waiting that had proved remarkably effective in encouraging others to speak more freely than they might otherwise have done. "I understand you have some observations regarding yesterday's incident," Inspector Thornton began, his tone suggesting that he was approaching this interview with the sort of professional courtesy one extends to well-meaning but ultimately uninformed civilians who believe their observations possess greater significance than is ordinarily the case. Miss Marple responded with her characteristic modesty, explaining that she had merely noted certain details during the exhibition and the subsequent investigation, details which might prove worth considering in conjunction with the more systematic inquiries that the inspector was conducting. She began not with accusations or elaborate theories, but rather with simple facts. She mentioned that she had observed Helena Marks displaying considerable composure in the aftermath of the destruction, a composure that seemed to Miss Marple to suggest either innocence so profound as to be remarkable, or alternatively, a prior expectation of some disturbance. She noted that Eleanor Ashford, despite her position as organizer of the exhibition, seemed to possess an anxiety that transcended the normal concerns of a woman whose event had been disrupted by vandalism, and that this anxiety appeared to intensify when she observed Dame Constance's reaction to the destruction. She mentioned, with careful understatement, that the vicar's private conversation with the inspector on the previous evening suggested that the church possessed knowledge of matters connected to the case, knowledge which the Reverend might be withholding due to considerations of pastoral confidence. Inspector Thornton's skepticism gradually transformed into something more akin to attentive interest as Miss Marple continued, and when she mentioned her discovery regarding the correspondence between both Dame Constance and Helena Marks with the same London solicitor, his eyes sharpened considerably. He leaned forward slightly, his fingers appled before him, and asked her to explain how she had come by this information. And Miss Marple responded with perfect honesty that she had obtained it through inquiry at the post office, a source which she described as reliable though admittedly unofficial. The inspector's expression suggested that he was simultaneously impressed by her resourcefulness and mildly chagrined that he had not himself thought to interview the postmistress with the sort of specificity that might have elicited such details. When Miss Marple went on to describe her discoveries in the newspaper archives regarding the closure of the Ashford Textile Manufacturing Company and the financial irregularities that had accompanied it, Inspector Thornton rose from his chair and began to pace the small office, his mind visibly engaged in the process of reassessing the case in light of these new details. He asked her directly whether she possessed any hypothesis regarding the identity of the person responsible for the destruction, and Miss Marple responded with the careful circumspection that had characterized her entire interview, explaining that while she had observed certain patterns of behavior that seemed significant, she could not in good conscience accuse any individual without more conclusive evidence than mere observation of emotional responses. What she did suggest, with the sort of gentle precision that characterized her recommendations, was that the inspector might profit from investigating the precise nature of the business relationship that had existed between Dame Constance and the Ashford Textile Manufacturing Company, and whether the company's closure might have involved disputes regarding the ownership or creation of designs and techniques that Dame Constance now credited to her own artistic vision. She further suggested that Eleanor Ashford's obvious anxiety might relate not to the destruction itself, but rather to concern about what the investigation might uncover regarding her family's business and the involvement of various parties in matters that had previously remained concealed. When Inspector Thornton inquired whether Miss Marple believed Eleanor Ashford to be responsible for the destruction, Miss Marple smiled gently and explained that she believed Eleanor's distress to stem from knowledge rather than culpability, though knowledge itself could be a burden of considerable weight. As the interview concluded, and Miss Marple prepared to depart, the inspector thanked her with a sincerity that suggested her contributions had genuinely altered the direction of his investigation, and he indicated that he would be pursuing several new lines of inquiry based upon the connections she had suggested. After she had returned to her cottage and settled herself in her comfortable armchair with her knitting, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the complex web of past betrayals, financial irregularities, and personal animosities that seemed to underlie the surface drama of the exhibition's disruption. Recognizing that the destruction of Dame Constance's embroidered panel represented merely the most visible manifestation of conflicts that ran far deeper and possessed consequences that no one had yet fully comprehended. The afternoon following Miss Marple's interview with Inspector Thornton proved to be one of considerable activity within the village, as the inspector, armed with the new directions suggested by Miss Marple's observations, began to pursue inquiries that would eventually reveal the hidden architecture of relationships and resentments that had constructed itself over the preceding years. Inspector Thornton obtained copies of the newspaper articles regarding the Ashford Textile Manufacturing Company's closure and the financial investigations that had accompanied it, and he subsequently conducted a lengthy interview with Reverend Edmund Ashford, an interview that seemed to consume considerably more time than the preliminary questioning of the previous day, suggesting that the vicar possessed information of substantial significance that required careful explanation. When the Reverend emerged from this interview, his expression carried the peculiar mixture of relief and burden that characterizes individuals who have finally disclosed secrets they have carried in silence. And he made his way directly to his home without pausing to engage in the sort of village conversation that ordinarily occupied his daily routine. Inspector Thornton, having received whatever disclosures the vicar had deemed appropriate to share, subsequently requested that Eleanor Ashford present herself for a more extensive interview, and when Eleanor arrived at the village hall with her husband accompanying her in a gesture of moral support, it became apparent to the assembled observers that the investigation had entered a new and more intense phase. What occurred during Eleanor's extended interview was not directly observable to Miss Marple, who had returned to her cottage to attend to her correspondence and her knitting, but the village's efficient gossip network ensured that by the time evening had descended upon St. Mary's, the broad outlines of what had been disclosed were known to most of those with an interest in such matters. Eleanor had apparently confessed to Inspector Thornton that she possessed detailed knowledge of the financial irregularities that had attended the closure of her family's textile company, and that she understood that Dame Constance Whitmore had once held a position within that company as a designer and embroiderer, a position from which she had departed under circumstances that had never been fully explained. To the village community, the financial investigations that had followed the company's closure had apparently concluded that certain proprietary designs and techniques, designs that had been created through collaborative effort and therefore ought to have belonged to the company and its shareholders, had instead been appropriated by various individuals and used for private purposes, a situation that had resulted in significant financial losses and had contributed substantially to the company's eventual insolvency. Eleanor's disclosure further suggested that her family had possessed knowledge of this appropriation, but had chosen not to pursue the matter through legal channels, a decision that had been motivated by considerations that Eleanor had not fully articulated, but which had apparently involved protecting individuals within the community whom the family held in regard despite their culpability in the financial wrongdoing. By the following morning, Inspector Thornton had requested that Dame Constance present herself for a formal interview, an interview that lasted more than 2 hours and appeared to consume a considerable portion of the inspector's emotional and intellectual resources, judging by the manner in which he emerged from that meeting with an expression suggesting he had been engaged in conversation with someone of considerable intelligence and considerable determination to present her perspective in the most favorable light possible. The village, by this point, was vibrating with speculation regarding what had occurred between these two formidable personalities, and Miss Marple, observing the patterns of conversation and the nervous energy that animated the community's ordinary activities, found herself constructing a more complete picture of the events that had led to the destruction of the embroidered panel. She understood, with a sort of intuitive certainty that characterized her most reliable conclusions, that Dame Constance had been the originating source of a deception, that she had appropriated designs created within the context of her employment at the Ashford Company and had subsequently presented them as her own work, a deception that had remained concealed for several years until the company's closure had prompted investigations that threatened to expose what had occurred. Most significantly, Miss Marple recognized that Helena Marks's appearance in the village was almost certainly not coincidental, that Helena had likely come to St. Mary's with knowledge of the financial irregularities and the appropriation of designs, knowledge that had been acquired through her own employment at the Ashford Company or through her connections to individuals who had possessed such knowledge. The destruction of Dame Constance's embroidered panel, when viewed through this developing understanding, appeared to Miss Marple to represent not an act of mere vandalism or uncontrolled rage, but rather a calculated message, a statement delivered through the symbolic destruction of the dame's most celebrated work, a work that had presumably incorporated at least some elements of design principles or techniques that had originated within the Ashford Company and had been unjustly appropriated. What remained unclear, however, was the identity of the individual responsible for the actual destruction, for while Miss Marple understood the motivation and the broader context, the specific perpetrator remained concealed within the shadows of the village's various competing interests and emotional investments. As she sat in her cottage that evening, reviewing her notes and contemplating the various possibilities, Miss Marple recognized that the investigation had reached a crucial juncture, a moment at which the accumulation of information ND understanding would soon crystallize into a revelation that would expose not merely the identity of the vandal, but also the web of deceptions and betrayals that had ensnared multiple members of the village community in complicity or concealment. On the third day, following the destruction of the embroidered panel, Inspector Thornton convened what he termed an informal gathering of the primary individuals involved in the case, a gathering that took place in the village hall, and which included not only those directly under suspicion, but also the vicar and several other villagers whom the inspector deemed relevant to his developing understanding of the matter. Miss Marple, having been invited at the inspector's specific request, occupied a position near the rear of the assembled group, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a particularly intricate Fair Isle pattern, her apparent inattention to the proceedings serving as effective camouflage for the intensity with which she observed every gesture, every hesitation, and every shift in the emotional atmosphere that characterized the room. Inspector Thornton began by explaining that his investigation had revealed the existence of financial irregularities connected to the closure of the Ashford Textile Manufacturing Company, and that these irregularities had involved the unauthorized appropriation of proprietary designs and techniques by individuals who had subsequently presented these designs as their own original creations. He indicated that this appropriation had resulted in significant financial losses to the company and its shareholders, and that the subsequent closure of the company had been substantially precipitated by these losses and the legal complications that had attended their discovery. The inspector then turned his attention to Dame Constance Whitmore, stating directly that his investigation had revealed that certain designs incorporated into her celebrated body of work had originated within the Ashford Company and had been created through collaborative effort by multiple individuals, including most notably Helena Marks, who had served as a junior designer within the company before its closure. He explained that Dame Constance had been employed by the company as a senior embroiderer during the period in which these designs had been created, and that she had apparently appropriated both the designs themselves and the collaborative work product of her colleagues, presenting them to the world as her own artistic creations, and subsequently achieving considerable fame and financial success through this appropriation. Dame Constance, who had maintained an expression of aristocratic composure throughout this recitation of facts, responded with a statement that acknowledged she had indeed incorporated certain design principles that had been discussed within the company environment, but that she insisted these principles had been transformed and reimagined through her own artistic vision and therefore constituted legitimate derivative work, rather than appropriation. Further stated that the financial difficulties of the Ashford Company had resulted from poor management and inferior business practices rather than from any loss attributable to her use of design principles, and that she had not deliberately concealed her professional history with the company, which she described as merely one chapter in a career that had encompassed considerably more significant accomplishments. Inspector Thornton then directed his attention toward Helena Marks, explaining that the investigation had revealed her arrival in the village to be motivated by her discovery that Dame Constance was residing in the vicinity and displaying work that contained elements traceable to designs created during Helena's employment at the Ashford Company. He suggested that Helena's presence in the village was not coincidental, but rather represented a deliberate decision to confront the situation that had resulted from the financial losses that had attended the company's closure and the subsequent loss of employment and professional opportunity that had affected individuals, including Helena herself. Helena, when addressed directly, initially maintained her characteristic composure, but as the Inspector's questions became more specific and probing regarding the precise timeline of her arrival in the village, and her communications with other individuals connected to the case, her controlled demeanor began to fracture, and she eventually acknowledged that she had indeed come to the village with the intention of confronting Dame Constance regarding the appropriation of work in which she had invested considerable professional and creative effort. However, Helena insisted vehemently that while she harbored considerable resentment regarding the dame's appropriation and the financial consequences that had resulted from it, she had not been responsible for the destruction of the embroidered panel, and that she viewed such vandalism as counterproductive to her objectives and inconsistent with her character. It was at this juncture that Miss Marple, setting down her knitting with deliberate care, rose from her chair and addressed the assembled group with a quietness that commanded immediate attention despite the absence of any elevation in her voice or any theatrical gesture. She explained that her observation of the events surrounding the exhibition had suggested to her that the destruction of the embroidered panel had been accomplished not by someone motivated by anger regarding the appropriation of designs or the financial losses that had resulted from it, but rather by someone motivated by different concerns entirely. Concerns that related to protecting reputations and concealing information that certain individuals wished to remain hidden. She indicated that her review of the available evidence suggested that the destruction had been motivated not by Helena Marks, whose resentment was legitimate and openly acknowledged, but rather by an individual who possessed a personal stake in ensuring that the full extent of the financial irregularities and the involvement of specific individuals in the appropriation scheme remained concealed from public scrutiny. She then turned her pale blue eyes directly toward Eleanor Ashford, whose face had drained of color, and suggested gently but with unmistakable clarity that the village's organizer of the exhibition had likely been the individual responsible for the destruction, acting from a motivation that combined filial loyalty to her family's business interests with a desire to protect the reputation of her family and perhaps to prevent the revelation of the extent to which family members had been aware of and complicit in the appropriation and concealment of the financial wrongdoings. Eleanor Ashford's initial response to Miss Marple's assertion was a denial so absolute and so fiercely delivered that it seemed to contain within it the force of genuine conviction, and she rose from her chair with such abruptness that it clattered backward against the floor with a sharp sound that reverberated through the suddenly silent village hall. She declared, with a voice that trembled with an emotion that might have been indignation or might have been fear, that she had no knowledge whatsoever of the destruction, and that she resented deeply the suggestion that she would perpetrate such an act which she correctly identified as both criminal and antithetical to everything she believed regarding the proper conduct of community affairs. However, Miss Marple, who had observed Eleanor's reaction with the careful attention of someone accustomed to distinguishing between genuine denial and the theatrical performance of innocence, merely smiled gently and suggested that Eleanor perhaps had not fully considered the implications of what she herself had disclosed to Inspector Thornton regarding her family's knowledge of the appropriation and their decision not to pursue legal remedies through official channels. She explained that it was precisely this decision and the motivations underlying it that had suggested to her the identity of the individual responsible for the destruction, for such a decision could only have been motivated by one of two considerations: either the family harbored affection or loyalty toward the individual who had perpetrated the appropriation. Or alternatively, the family itself possessed complicity in the scheme, and therefore could not afford to permit legal proceedings that might expose their own involvement. Inspector Thornton, who had been observing this exchange with the keen attention of a professional accustomed to reading the nuances of human interaction, leaned forward slightly and asked Miss Marple to elaborate upon her reasoning, requesting that she explain precisely how she had arrived at Eleanor Ashford as the perpetrator based upon the evidence that she had assembled. Miss Marple responded by systematically reviewing the observations that had led her to her conclusion, beginning with her notation that Eleanor had displayed an anxiety that seemed to transcend the ordinary concerns of someone whose event had been disrupted by vandalism, and that this anxiety had intensified specifically when Eleanor observed Dame Constance's reaction to the destruction, rather than when she initially discovered the damage itself. She explained that this pattern of emotional response suggested that Eleanor was concerned not with the destruction as an isolated incident, but rather with the implications of that destruction for the disclosure of information regarding her family's business and her family's knowledge of and complicity in the financial wrongdoings. Miss Marple further noted that Eleanor had possessed both the opportunity and the access necessary to accomplish the destruction. As the organizer of the exhibition, she would have been able to move about the village hall without attracting observation, and she would have possessed knowledge of when particular areas of the hall would be temporarily unobserved. Most significantly, Miss Marple explained, Eleanor's emotional investment in preventing the full disclosure of the circumstances surrounding the Ashford Company's closure would have provided her with a powerful motivation that transcended even the motivation that might have animated Helena Marks or Dame Constance herself. Eleanor had grown up within a family whose reputation and social standing within the community had been established through generations of respectable business conduct, and the revelation that her family had possessed knowledge of and had chosen not to address financial wrongdoings would have constituted a profound threat to the family's standing and to Eleanor's own sense of identity and belonging within the village where she had spent her entire life. When Inspector Thornton pressed Miss Marple further regarding whether she possessed any concrete evidence beyond these observations and inferences, Miss Marple responded by inquiring whether he had examined Eleanor's hands and fingers with particular attention to their condition, and whether he had noted any evidence of cuts, abrasions, or the sorts of marks that would naturally result from handling embroidered fabric and torn thread while engaged in the act of destruction. The inspector, galvanized into action by this suggestion, immediately requested that Eleanor permit an examination of her hands. And when Eleanor initially demurred, he explained that such an examination would be conducted with or without her consent, given the serious nature of the allegations. What the examination revealed, when Eleanor finally permitted it with obvious reluctance, was precisely what Miss Marple had anticipated: several small cuts and abrasions on Eleanor's fingers and the palms of her hands, marks that bore the characteristic appeara. NCE of wounds inflicted by sharp embroidery needles and torn thread, wounds that were several days old and consistent with the time frame of the destruction. Confronted with this physical evidence and with the mounting accumulation of circumstantial factors that all pointed toward her culpability, Eleanor's resistance finally crumbled, and she sank back into her chair with a gesture of surrender that seemed to deflate all the anger and defiance that had animated her moments before. She confessed, in a voice reduced to barely a whisper, that she had indeed destroyed the embroidered panel, acting on impulse when she had observed Dame Constance preparing to make adjustments to her display, and had recognized in that moment the opportunity to prevent the panel from remaining on public exhibition, a panel that seemed to her to represent the crystallization of all the family's shame and complicity and financial wrongdoing. Eleanor's confession, once begun, seemed to flow from her with the force of something long contained and finally permitted release, and she proceeded to detail with considerable specificity the circumstances that had motivated her actions and the emotional turmoil that had preceded the act of destruction itself. She explained that she had been aware for several years of the financial irregularities that had attended the Ashford Company's operations, knowledge that had come to her gradually through overheard conversations between her parents and the family solicitors, conversations in which her parents had discussed their dilemma regarding how to address the appropriation of company designs without exposing their own knowledge of the situation, or their complicity in deciding not to pursue legal remedies. She indicated that her parents had apparently harbored affection or loyalty toward Dame Constance, though Eleanor was uncertain regarding the precise nature of that relationship, and this affection had led them to decide that pursuing legal action would be counterproductive and would cause suffering to an individual toward whom they possessed complicated feelings that extended beyond mere professional concerns. Eleanor had carried this knowledge in silence throughout her adolescence and into adulthood, a silence that had gradually transformed from discretion into complicity, and when Helena Marks had arrived in the village, Eleanor had immediately recognized the significance of that arrival and had understood that the carefully maintained concealment of the past was in danger of being exposed. The exhibition had seemed to Eleanor to represent a culmination of all these suppressed anxieties and concealed histories, particularly when she had observed that Dame Constance intended to display work that Eleanor knew. Through her own detailed familiarity with the company's design archives, contained elements that directly paralleled designs that had originated within the Ashford Company and had been created through collaborative effort. When Eleanor had discovered the opportunity to approach the display, while it remained temporarily unobserved, she had acted with what she described as a kind of desperate impulsiveness, driven by a desire to prevent the public exhibition of work that seemed to her to embody the injustice and the concealment that had poisoned her family's reputation and her own sense of integrity. She had not, she insisted, harbored any intention of causing permanent damage to a work of art, but rather had acted with the vague hope that the destruction might somehow force a confrontation with the truth regarding the appropriation and the financial wrongdoings, a confrontation that might permit the family to finally acknowledge what had occurred and to move forward without the burden of continued concealment. However, as she had engaged in the actual act of tearing apart the embroidered panel, destroying with her bare hands months of painstaking artistic labor, she experienced a profound shift in her emotional state, a recognition that she was committing an act that was itself criminal and destructive, an act that would cause suffering and would ultimately fail to accomplish the confrontation with truth that she had vaguely hoped to precipitate. Inspector Thornton, listening to this extended confession with the careful attention of a professional investigator, found himself confronting a situation that transcended the simple category of vandalism or property destruction and entered instead into the more morally ambiguous territory of human motivation and psychological disturbance. He indicated that Eleanor would be formally charged with the destruction of property and that the matter would be subject to legal proceedings, but he also suggested that the circumstances surrounding her actions might be presented to the court in a manner that conveyed the psychological pressures and family complications that had motivated her conduct. Reverend Edmund Ashford, who had maintained a position of painful witness throughout these proceedings, stepped forward and placed a hand upon Eleanor's shoulder in a gesture that conveyed both compassion and the weight of his pastoral concern, and he suggested to Inspector Thornton that the vicar's office might benefit from being permitted to provide spiritual guidance to Eleanor during the period preceding her trial, a suggestion that the inspector accepted with evident understanding of the human dimensions of the situation that extended beyond the purely legal considerations. What struck Miss Marple most profoundly as she observed the aftermath of Eleanor's confession was not the dramatic reversal of fortune that the confession had precipitated, but rather the complex web of human relationships and emotional investments that the case had revealed, a web that illustrated the ways in which financial wrongdoing and moral compromise could ripple forward through time, affecting innocent parties and creating circumstances in which individuals were forced to choose between loyalty to family and adherence to ethical principles. She recognized that Eleanor's destruction of the embroidered panel represented not a calculated criminal act, but rather a desperate gesture born of accumulated emotional pressure and the burden of carrying knowledge of family complicity, and that the true casualties of the original appropriation and the subsequent concealment extended far beyond the financial losses that the Ashford Company had suffered, to include the psychological and moral compromises that had been imposed upon the family members who had chosen to remain silent. As the village hall gradually emptied of its assembled observers, and the village began the process of absorbing the revelations that had transformed their understanding of Eleanor Ashford and the hidden dimensions of their own community, Miss Marple gathered her knitting with deliberate care and prepared to return to her cottage, her pale blue eyes reflecting a sadness that suggested she understood that the most profound crimes were often not those committed in moments of sudden rage or calculated malice, but rather those committed through complicity and concealment, through the slow accumulation of ethical compromises that gradually transformed ordinary individuals into something less than they had originally been. The week following Eleanor's confession proved to be one of considerable turbulence within the village, as the revelation of the financial wrongdoings connected to the Ashford Textile Manufacturing Company and the family's subsequent concealment of these matters rippled through the community's carefully maintained social fabric, disrupting assumptions and relationships that had existed for years in what many residents now recognized to have been deliberate ignorance. Inspector Thornton remained in the village for several additional days, conducting supplementary interviews and gathering documentation that would support the legal proceedings that were being initiated against Eleanor. And during this period, he also pursued further inquiries regarding the involvement of other parties in the original appropriation scheme that had precipitated the company's closure. What emerged from these inquiries was a far more complicated picture than the initial investigation had suggested, one that revealed Dame Constance Whitmore to have been not the sole appropriator of company designs, but rather one participant in a scheme that had involved multiple individuals, including certain members of the company's management who had conspired with Dame Constance and others to misrepresent designs created through collaborative effort as individual creations that could be appropriated and exploited for private financial gain. The investigation revealed that Reverend Edmund Ashford had been aware of these arrangements and had apparently participated in the decision not to pursue legal remedies, a decision that had been motivated by his concern that legal proceedings might expose his own family's involvement in activities that would have constituted breach of fiduciary duty and misappropriation of company assets. This revelation regarding the vicar's knowledge and complicity created a profound crisis within the village church and within the broader community's relationship to the institution that the Reverend had served for nearly 30 years with apparent dedication and moral authority. The vicar offered his resignation from his position, recognizing that his moral credibility had been irreparably damaged by his participation in the decision to conceal the wrongdoings, and he explained to his parishioners in a statement of considerable humility that his actions had been motivated by misguided loyalty to his wife's family rather than by proper adherence to ethical principles, and that he recognized he was unfit to continue serving as a spiritual guide to a community while harboring such fundamental moral compromises. His resignation was accepted with a mixture of relief and sadness by the parish council, and arrangements were made for a replacement vicar to assume the position following a period of transition, during which the Reverend would gradually withdraw from his pastoral duties. What impressed Miss Marple most profoundly about the Reverend's response to the revelation of his complicity was the absence of defensiveness or self-justification, the willingness to acknowledge his moral failure and to accept the consequences of his actions. A response that suggested a capacity for genuine moral growth and self-examination that many individuals in such circumstances would not have demonstrated. Helena Marks, vindicated by the investigation and freed from the suspicion that had initially attached itself to her presence in the village, found herself in the unexpected position of being recognized as a victim rather than a suspect, and the village community's attitude toward her underwent a gradual transformation as the particulars of her situation became more widely understood. She had sacrificed professional opportunity and financial security to relocate to the village with the intention of confronting the injustice that she had suffered as a consequence of Dame Constance's appropriation of her work, and the investigation had revealed that her designs had indeed been incorporated into several of Dame Consta NCE's celebrated pieces, though the dame had transformed and reimagined these designs sufficiently to create what might technically be considered derivative work rather than direct theft. However, the investigation also revealed that Helena had never received acknowledgement or compensation for her contributions, and that the financial losses that had attended the Ashford Company's closure had directly impacted her career prospects and financial security. Several of the village's more prominent women, recognizing the injustice of Helena's situation, began to extend to her invitations to social gatherings and to offer her the sort of community integration that had been lacking during her initial months in the village, a transformation in social acceptance that seemed to ease to some degree the bitterness that had motivated her relocation. Dame Constance Whitmore, stripped of the veneer of artistic genius, and revealed instead as someone who had built her career upon the appropriated work of others, found herself in a situation that was professionally and reputationally devastating. Several of her celebrated pieces were withdrawn from exhibitions in London and elsewhere as institutions recognized that the designs incorporated into these works had not originated with the dame herself, and the critical reassessment of her body of work became mercilessly harsh, as critics and colleagues recognized the extent to which her reputation had been constructed upon a foundation of appropriation and deception. The dame departed from the village within 10 days of Eleanor's confession, departing without the fanfare of official goodbye, or the sort of social acknowledgement that might ordinarily attend the departure of a distinguished guest. And her sudden absence seemed to create a void in the village's collective consciousness that was filled quickly with other concerns and considerate ions. Miss Marple, observing the dame's departure with her characteristic thoughtfulness, recognized that in many respects the dame had been as much a victim of her own ambitions and ethical compromises as she had been a perpetrator of wrongdoing, that the appropriation scheme had emerged from a particular moment in the company's history when financial pressures and competitive anxieties had created circumstances in which the boundaries between legitimate derivative work and illegitimate appropriation had become dangerously blurred. The legal proceedings against Eleanor Ashford progressed through the winter months with a deliberation that seemed to Miss Marple entirely appropriate to the complicated moral and psychological circumstances that surrounded the case, and by the time spring had begun to assert itself through the village's gardens and hedgerows, a resolution had been reached that satisfied neither pure justice nor pure mercy, but rather occupied the ambiguous middle ground where such complicated cases typically find their conclusion. Eleanor was convicted of destruction of property and sentenced to 18 months of imprisonment, a sentence that was considerably lighter than it might have been due to the mitigating circumstances that her legal counsel had presented, circumstances that included her lack of prior criminal history, her psychological state at the time of the offense, and the genuine provocation that she had experienced as a consequence of her family's complicity in the original wrongdoings. The sentence included a provision for review after 6 months, with the possibility of early release contingent upon demonstration of genuine remorse and psychological rehabilitation, and Miss Marple recognized in this arrangement the sort of practical wisdom that characterized the better elements of the legal system, a recognition that some crimes emerged for moral failure and psychological disturbance rather than from genuinely criminal inclination. Eleanor's departure from the village to serve her sentence was attended by a quiet dignity that seemed to Miss Marple to suggest that the younger woman had achieved, through the process of confession and legal accountability, a kind of moral clarity that might ultimately permit her to rebuild her life and her relationship to her community upon foundations that were more authentic and less burdened by concealment. The Ashford family, following the revelations regarding their knowledge of and participation in the concealment of the original wrongdoings, found themselves obliged to engage in a process of financial reckoning with those who had been harmed by the appropriation scheme and the subsequent collapse of the company. Legal settlements were negotiated with Helena Marks, and with several other former employees of the company who had suffered financial losses as a consequence of the company's closure, settlements that, while not fully compensating for the losses incurred, nevertheless represented a genuine acknowledgement of wrongdoing and a commitment to making whatever restitution was possible, given the constraints of the family's financial circumstances. The Ashford home, which had stood as a symbol of the family's social prominence for nearly a century, was eventually placed on the market, as the family determined that they would relocate to another county and attempt to construct a new life unburdened by the weight of their previous position and the scandals that had attached themselves to their name. Miss Marple observed this dissolution of one of the village's most prominent families with a sadness that was tempered by her understanding that sometimes the most genuine form of moral progress required the dismantling of structures that had become fundamentally corrupted by deception and concealment. Helena Marks, vindicated and compensated to the degree that legal settlement could provide, discovered that her relocation to the village, which had begun as a mission of confrontation and justice, had gradually transformed into something more substantial and more genuinely rooted in community belonging. She established a small needlework studio in the village, offering instruction in traditional embroidery techniques and serving as a consultant to younger women interested in developing their skills in textile arts, and her presence in this role seemed to offer to the village a kind of redemptive possibility, a sense that something positive and creative might emerge from the ruins of the scandal that had disrupted the community's peace. Several of the village women, who had initially been distant or suspicious of Helena, gradually became her students and her friends. And Miss Marple recognized in these developing relationships the possibility that communities possess the capacity to heal and to reintegrate individuals who had been initially rejected, though such healing required time and the willingness of both the community and the individual to move beyond the circumstances of initial encounter. As spring deepened into early summer, and the village gradually returned to the rhythms and routines that characterized its ordinary existence, Miss Marple found herself reflecting upon the case with the sort of philosophical detachment that characterized her approach to the mysteries that periodically disrupted the peace of her village and others she had inhabited. She recognized that the destruction of Dame Constance's embroidered panel, which had initially appeared to be a crime of passion or vandalism motivated by jealousy or resentment, had instead emerged from far deeper sources, from the accumulated weight of family complicity and concealment, from the psychological burden of carrying knowledge of wrongdoing while maintaining the appearance of respectability, and from the desperate attempt of a young woman to force a confrontation with truths that had been deliberately obscured and hidden. The case had illustrated, with considerable clarity, Miss Marple's fundamental conviction that human beings were far more complicated than their surface appearances suggested, that motivations were frequently layered and contradictory, and that genuine understanding of criminal behavior required attention not merely to the obvious facts of the offense, but to the psychological and emotional circumstances from which such offenses emerged. She recognized that Eleanor Ashford had not been a criminal in the traditional sense, but rather an ordinary young woman who had been placed in extraordinary circumstances by the moral failures and deceptions of those whom she loved, and who had ultimately responded to that situation in a manner that, while legally culpable, was profoundly understandable to anyone possessed of sufficient compassion and psychological insight to recognize the complexity of human motivation. One afternoon in late May, as Miss Marple sat in her cottage garden with her knitting, observing the roses beginning to emerge in their summer profusion, Helena Marks appeared at her gate and requested permission to enter, a request that Miss Marple granted with evident pleasure. Helena thanked Miss Marple for her role in unraveling the truth regarding the case, acknowledging that without Miss Marple's careful observation and psychological insight, the matter would likely have remained concealed or been resolved in a manner that would have left the true injustices unaddressed. Miss Marple responded with her characteristic modesty, explaining that she had merely observed what others had overlooked, and that understanding human behavior was simply a matter of recognizing that people behaved in patterns, that these patterns reflected their fundamental natures and their circumstances, and that attention to these patterns frequently revealed truths that were otherwise hidden. As Helena departed, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her needles clicking softly in the afternoon quietness, her mind already turning toward other concerns and observations, secure in the knowledge that she had contributed, in her small and unobtrusive way, to the restoration of a measure of justice and truth to her village, and that this was perhaps the most important work that any individual could accomplish.